All right.
Hi, this is Steve Hargreaves, and this is our final session of the 2013 School Leadership Summit. What a delightful day, and what a great way to cap things off, talking with Michael Fullan. Michael, thanks so much for being here.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
And thanks for overcoming the technical difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks to TCAL, Wilson Consulting, the Asia Society, and Intel for their support of this event. It's been just a great day. Especially we express appreciation to the Asia Society for their support with our keynotes today. This is a chance for those of you in the listening audience to indicate where you're participating from. I'm not going to dwell too long on this because we've lost a little bit of time, but it will be fun for Michael to see or hear sort of the worldwide scope of the conference today. And as you indicate on the map, those locations, I'm going to kind of cue up the conversation. There is a Mighty Bell space for this show, so continued conversation or resources can be placed in the link that is in the chat now. And Michael, we've got from Russia to New Zealand to Australia to Brazil to North America.
Great.
Okay, so I interviewed Mark Tucker on my Future of Education show about a book he wrote called Surpassing Shanghai. And Ontario is a really significant part of this story. And I didn't realize just sort of how intimately involved and associated you were with what took place there. Can you talk a little bit about the progress that's been made?
Sure. I mean, Ontario, there is no federal agency of education in Canada, so think of each province as independent in education. So Ontario has 12 million people, 5,000 schools, 2 million students in the public school system. And there was an election in 2003 when a new Liberal leader came in, and his name is Dalton McGuinty. And he appointed me as his chief advisor at the beginning, and we took a stagnant system that is flatlined in terms of literacy, numeracy, high school graduation. And it's a long strategy story. We've written about it, but and certainly Mark Tucker and others have captured it because they've been up here and they've interviewed us. But what we did was have a fairly strong agenda from the center, that is the government level, saying we're going to focus on literacy, numeracy, and high school graduation, innovation at secondary schools. And we're going to engage in capacity building with the sector in a kind of partnership. So we then began to invest in what are the changes that have to be made in the way that teaching is taught, literacy, numeracy. What about the role of data? Making sure we use what we call non-judgmentalism, so it wasn't heavy-handed accountability, high expectations with transparency. And I could get at other things, but basically it's capacity building, raise the bar, close the gap for all students in all schools. And what we've accomplished, it started within year 2, but certainly this is now 9 years later, high school graduation has gone from 68%, this is across 900 schools, to 82%, and it's about to climb again another 2%. So really phenomenal success. Literacy, same huge gains, including closing the gap for special education, reducing the gap is a better way of putting it, in terms of performance, special education, English language learners. We have a lot of immigrants. And so by and large, a really strong success story. And as you said, Mark Tucker has interviewed us, looked at the data, and written about it, as have McKinsey Group is another group, and a couple of others have written about it.
I think there's a huge story here. We've been talking in my interview series about Pasi Sahlberg's global education reform movement germ idea. We look a lot in the United States at kind of how we think about making progress. Canada represents, to me, much more potential for learning than Finland does, say for the United States, because of so many similarities and because of some very specific things that I was just so happy to read about and sort of see the story in the book. Can you tell me how important trust is in the process you've been through?
Clearly trust is a big factor, but the question is how do you get it if you don't have it, right? You can't just say, I'm going to be trustworthy, please, participate. So you have to prove that you're trustworthy. And a big issue around this, I think, I spend half of my time in the U.S. We're working a lot in quite a few states, actually. So I know that system quite well, or the systems. But you have to, I think what you have to do, and it requires policymakers to have a certain mindset. You can't go in there with heavy-handed punitive accountability and expect to establish trust. Obviously, just by saying it that way, it's clear that it won't happen. So we have this combination of high expectations, transparency, so everything's out in the open. But we tried to basically take a capacity building approach and say, we're not going to be heavily handed punitive, we're going to work with you and make improvements, and that's how we're going to get somewhere. And that builds trust, and once you get a certain degree of trust, it feeds on itself. Opposite applies too. When you get lack of trust, it feeds on distrust. So trust is key, but it begs the question about how you get it, and you have to take that stance that, in fact, the best districts in the U.S., the ones that are successful, like Long Beach or Garden Grove in California, Sanger in California, places where we work in, they follow the same rules at the district level. They create high expectations, strong focus, capacity building, the big emphasis on results. They create the trust of the partnership that will be required to get some movement.
So is this what you, as you describe these core principles, are these part of what you mean when you talk about being change savvy? It's been at different levels. I did a book called All Systems Go, which by the title it conveys that. So one, we've taken, I guess I'll say, depends on who the focus is. So the focus for me, has been sometimes it's the whole system. So that would be the state of California. It could be a district, but that's the minimal size. So in that sense, there's a certain degree of, I call them in things I've written about the wrong and the right drivers. So the right drivers are capacity building, teamwork. Just going down the list, there are 4 of them. Teamwork is the second one. Instructional focus, or the core, is the third one, and then coordinated policies is the fourth one. And then the wrong drivers are punitive accountability, individualism, relying on technology without pedagogy, and ad hoc policies. So that's the level we get at it with systems. But if I'm talking individual leaders, which is our motion leadership label, I talk about change savvy. So I guess if you wanted to use that language, the first one is system savvy. How do you get the whole system to change? But if I'm zeroing in on individual leaders, like a school principal, district superintendent, or other leaders, then I'm talking about our motion leadership directives, because it's about the particular leaders that have to do something. So I'm reminded I've got a picture on the screen that you're not seeing. It's the 2 motion leadership books. But in reading these books, yeah, I kept thinking about the total quality movement. It kept bringing me back to this sense of how change can actually take place and the importance of certain things working and certain other things not working. Is there a connection for you with that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you could go back to the original work of Deming and those 14 qualities or whatever themes that he has in there. They're very consistent with what works, and so people haven't, they've sort of lost sight of them, but his 14 qualities, when you really look at them, are the right drivers, because what the qualities do is they motivate people to put in the energy to get the work, to get the results, and that's what he knew way back when. And one of his 14 is drive fear out of the organization. I can't remember the whole list of them, because I don't have them in front of me, but you just take that drive fear of the organization. That's our non-judgmentalism. That's exactly what that is, because if you have judgmentalism and it's in your face all the time, it causes people to cover up and to pull back, get defensive, get mobilized for a fight instead of for the action that's needed to get the improvement. So he was right ages ago, and we've lost sight of it.
So you have 8 elements of this motion leadership, and one of them is actually change itself. And as a part of that, you talk about beware of fat plans. So what I'm kind of hearing from you is you've got this sort of high level of, this isn't that difficult, right? There are 4 wrong drivers, there are 4 right drivers. Let's not let the tail wag the dog. Let's not get so involved in the details that we miss this high level picture. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I borrowed Jeff Kluger's phrase. He wrote a book called Simplexity, and it's a very good phrase for concept for what I want, because the simple part is a small number of key things. They're not simplistic, but you can define them, you can understand them. The complex part is how do you make them work together when you have personalities in politics and levels of complexity. So you mentioned the implementation plan, and when you think of it this way, it really becomes obvious that we know, for example, that, and I like Doug Reeves' observation on this, where he said the size and the prettiness of the implementation plan is inversely related to the quality of action. And then he has the data to show that. And we've seen the same thing. And when you look at an elaborate implementation plan, what it means is the planners have tried to get it right on paper. Well, getting it right on paper ends up to be not grounded in the cognitive clarity or the emotions of people who have to implement it. So we have the paradox here is the implementation plan actually is not for the planners, it's for the implementers. Therefore, you better develop an implementation plan that has, that's sticky, that inspires action, that's memorable, that people can refer to it. And all of the systems we've worked in that are successful, people in school after school, including custodians, they know the core goals of the system. They know that the strategy is to invest in the developing of people and putting in the results. So you really get the implementation plan cannot become real if it's too complex on paper. And we have tons of examples of how easy this is to do. I just want to take one more step here on this. A district superintendent called me last year, said, we're having trouble, our people are running out of energy. We're using your ideas. Can you come and work with us? So I asked him to send me the district-wide plan, which he did, and it was 31 pages long. It had 16 goals, and it had 8 other things across the matrix at the top as to who does what. And you just read that and you say, well, yeah, it makes sense on paper, but how likely is it, and there were 41 schools in his district, that the principals would tell me what was in that plan if I were to ask 5 of them randomly? How likely is it the teachers would say, yeah, I know the implementation plan and I embrace it? So we actually asked them to reduce it to 3 core goals, clusters, which they had no trouble doing. We went and worked with them for 6 sessions and they took off. And it's because the plan then became amenable and closer to action instead of this fancy plan on paper that nobody could really remember and put into play.
There's so much of brilliance here that it's pretty easy to see why you've had such an impact. When you talked about in the book, Peters and Waterman's phrase, ready, fire, aim, is that a part of getting past these detailed plans?
Yeah, I think it's so. I mean, they wrote that in 1982, I guess it was. It was a long time ago anyways. And they Tom Peters has a way of being somewhat cavalier about his observations. So it's only a metaphor. But we see it very clearly now that if you're dealing with something, because what you want to do is create ownership and capacity on the part of implementers. And so if we take any system like a school with a district with 12 schools or 200 schools, or in our own case, 5,000 schools, if you're going to create ownership and clarity and skills among a large number of people, you don't load it up at the front end to get it and try to get it right and then implement it. It just won't work. So ready, fire, aim is actually a very good metaphor because it says, yeah, get ready, make sure you're have identified some key goals, be committed to the moral imperative, we call it, raise the bar, close the gap, but then get into action sooner than later, because it's the action, the purposeful action, where you create the new skills and clarity, where you actually create ownership during the process. You cannot get ownership in advance of doing something. You can get superficial buy-in, but usually you don't even get that. But you definitely can't get ownership until you do it. So it's only a metaphor, but ready means, yeah, get the right direction. Fire means purposeful action, which is full of capacity building, which means new skills, new clarity. It starts to create ownership. And then aim is, to put it that way in this metaphor, is consolidating what you're learning and then doing it more purposefully and effectively at the next phase. And then it gets stronger and stronger. And that's really pretty much what we've done in the last 9 years in Ontario.
There's obviously more to this, because you tell this great story of Steve Munby and the 500 phone calls. How important is the relationship piece here?
The relationship is key, but it has to have two things. It has to have a degree of specificity. That is, it's not just good relationship. It's particulars. So that's one thing. And then it has to have something you mentioned earlier, which is trust. So specificity or content plus trust. And that's what, with Steve began to build that relationship in doing that. But it's the same thing if we look at the principalship. I like Vivian Robinson, who's a professor in Auckland, New Zealand. When she did the study of school principals, the meta-studies of all kinds of research, she found 5 things that principals did that were related to student achievement. And one of the 5 was twice as important in terms of the effect size than the other 4. And it was literally this. I'm paraphrasing her finding here. The degree to which the principal participated as a learner in working with staff to move the school forward. If you just take that phrase, participate as a learner, it means 2 things. One, it's you're there doing it and building relationships. And 2, you're learning something because you're actually dealing with the content. And if you imagine Steve at the beginning of his head of the National College, when he spent those 2 months or so with the phone calls, he was participating as a learner, saying to school principals, how well have we been serving you? How do we have to do it differently? And he was building relationships, but he was getting content. And that both of those then made the next phase more possible, because the next phase was then to begin the action that built on that. So it was a great thing. I mean, it sounded like a huge investment of time, and it was a certain amount of time, but what it was he was actually going slow to go fast would be the best way of putting it, right? He was spending a little extra time at the front end doing all these calls, but it made the action at the second phase way more rapid than if he had just, for example, done some vision work and got into it where he didn't have those relationships. He didn't have that refinement of content that he got from that very specific exchange.
It might be tempting to call that modeling learning, but it feels like it's more than that. It feels like there was an authentic interest in really figuring out what needed to be done.
Yeah, I think modeling. Modeling is a good word for it, but I guess you can't fake modeling. I mean, you can fake it, but it's not effective. So he's not doing it just to manipulate the relationship. He's doing it because he fundamentally believed, I've got to build a relationship here with these school principals. There are 25,000 of them in this case in England. I've got to start building relationships here. I've got to find out what's on their mind so I can, mesh and relate to that. So he just, that's the change kind of substance of that he knew would be necessary. So it wasn't a technique for him. It was, this is how change leaders have to work if they're going to make any progress.
So you talk about whole system reform, and at the same time we're experiencing a period in the history of our culture or as humans where the internet seems to be moving us away from systems and institutions. So how do you do the peer connecting piece?
Well, we're working a fair amount with technology now, and I would say that technology I mean, I wrote a book called Stratosphere last year. It was one of the early chapters was the dark side of the internet. So the evidence is it's not all glory, but when you look at it, you can see that depending on how you approach it, that technology in the media and the way that the internet has exploded, it certainly is conducive to a lot of isolationism and lone learners, so to speak, but it's also pretty obvious that when you use it purposefully, it's a fantastic collaborative tool. So that just the very word social media, I mean, if you think of social media put to a good purpose, which is learning and applied problem solving. This is why, remember the drivers, the paired drivers I had was technology, wrong driver, instruction and pedagogy, right driver. What I mean by that is that if you start thinking of learning as the driver and then you say to yourself, how can we use technology to accelerate and deepen it, then you've got the right equation. So I look on technology as a fantastic resource in the service of greater collaboration that can occur. And in any case, it's not just technology, because you can have lots of collaboration within the schools that we see that don't depend on technology, but have people working together, what we've called the social capital of the quality of either the district or the school. Social capital is the quality of the group working together to get something done. And if you start to build up your social capital, which is relationships with purpose and skills, zeroing in on something that you're trying to accomplish and using the collective ingenuity to get there. Lots of examples of how that works, and then people see it, they like it, they want to do more of it. So I'm an optimist on the technology side, but I also realize that it can spin out in negative ways.
So does your principles here, principles is the wrong word, does your framework here for leadership have implications for this idea of school leaders as CEOs? How do you respond to the kind of movement toward running schools as a business?
Yeah, I think you could use the CEO concept. Let's just take it at a general level for a moment, which is that sometimes people say it's too bad schools are, that business thinking is influencing schools because it's ruining things. But when you actually, I would observe it and say it's too bad that bad business ideas are getting in, because when you go to the good businesses, the ones that Jim Collins and others have written about and analyzed, they have pretty much the qualities that we've found in the best school systems, which are great leadership, that mobilizes other leadership, that develops collaboration, that's committed to a high purpose, that mobilizes data to not only monitor but influence and get better at that. So I do think that we could think of the principal, for example, or the superintendent as a CEO. But what that means is that, again, I'll just say the direct link to business is that business that's effective. A CEO is, effective CEO is someone who mobilizes the leadership in the organization to get really important things done and have people committed and satisfied and doing more of those. So it is, it's an all right analogy. I don't use it myself, but it's not that far off, because we are talking about leaders who are building the social capital of the organization, whether we're talking about a principal vis-a-vis teachers and students and community, or we're talking about a superintendent in relation to the 12 to 500 schools that they're dealing with. So it's pretty much running a big organization and motivating people to focus, to work with each other, to accomplish results that they haven't accomplished before. That's essentially it.
You've made me remember how much I liked Jim Collins' material, and now I want to go back and kind of rethink it, and some of his conclusions about leadership. In your section on...
Well, he had his, he had his, the first one that made him famous, so to speak, but his last one, which is called Great by Choice, really good stuff in there, just that's consistent with the earlier work, but more refined to the, to the present findings. And It's really about focused, disciplined work that builds capacity and commitment, and doesn't go overboard on trying to manipulate things in a narrow way.
So you talk about capacity building trumping judgmentalism. And there's a fair amount of material on Jamie Oliver, and I did not know much about him, but really appreciated it. What did he do that was so enlightening?
Well, I'm always looking for interesting stories or examples of people who, against the odds, began to get something done that most people thought couldn't be done. So we know, in England especially, where he was successful, here's a guy that's a young chef, knew lots about healthy food and tasty food, saw his own kids were 3, 4, 5 years of age, saw that they were just eating, he uses rough language, but eating crap in school, and then he wanted to make a contribution. So let's call that his moral purpose. He said, I've got knowledge, I've got expertise, I've got resources and leverage. Let me now try to influence what kids are eating in school, because we know they're eating crappy stuff that not only is bad for them in their health, but it's also bad in relation to learning. There's the medical evidence that he compiled around that showed kids were less focused, more tired, heading towards ill health and right away, let alone when they grew up. So what's a good change example is he had the expertise, but he didn't make a fatal mistake, which often people with expertise do. I'll put it this way. Being right is not a strategy. I don't know whether that sort of comes across, but being right is not a strategy. So let's take Jamie. He was right about the food analysis, but he didn't go in with a strategy that said, I'm right, please listen to me. He went in with a strategy that said, these people don't know I'm right, so how am I going to handle this? And then he got to the food ladies who ran the cafeterias. They didn't know anything about the good food. And so he had to, here as an expert, figure out, I've come to call it impressive empathy. Impressive empathy is when you have empathy for someone who doesn't think like you do, and you need them to be more open-minded, but you're empathetic to where they're coming from. So the dinner ladies, they're called, at the head of the cafeteria, Nora was one in particular that was featured in his work. So he converted that person who became then a leader along with him to convert others. So what's brilliant about it is here's someone with a strong moral purpose, is smart enough to say, I have to win people over who don't know what I know, and I'm not going to win them over with sheer evidence. I've got to build relationships here, and I've got to work with people. So in his series, you see the frustrations that he went through and how he kind of persevered, was resilient, had empathy, built relationships, and eventually was successful. So it's a very good regular example from everyday life about how you can get change and how actually simple it is on the one hand, because good food and that's better for you and it's going to make you healthier and it's tastier must be a good proposition. Simple on the one hand, but to overcome the habits and the culture that preceded that and is built in order to overcome that is brilliant at the same time. So I liked it because it's a good example of change and sophistication, but kept the human doable element to it through leadership.
I'm not the only one who's madly typing. People are in the chat as well. Those are just really impressive quotes. Another one from the book for me was that his moral purpose kept him from being overly judgmental or negative.
Yeah, and that's a difficulty. Just think moral purpose in education, which is a passionate commitment to the betterment of students' lives, especially those that are disadvantaged. You can see with that how valuable that is, but you can also see that it might make you impatient with others who aren't kind of responding, teachers, for example. So for me, it's possible and dangerous in a sense. This is an odd way of putting it, but I would say you can have too much moral purpose. And if you're so committed that you're not sensitive to who you're dealing with and how you motivate people, you just actually create battleground. And a lot of change agents have failed on that. So I think what Jamie had and what we look for in leaders is this combination of having strong values themselves about what needs to change, and then having this impressive empathy that I've got to build relationships with people who don't know what I know. And I've got to learn a little bit from them, but I've also got to build the relationships where they will have a chance of actually getting the right ideas into place. So it's this very sophisticated combination of having strong moral purpose and having the flexibility and resilience of how you overcome obstacles and build relationships. And then once you get some things going, once you get some momentum, it then can feed on itself and be much stronger.
Am I over-interpreting your work if I see a really significant parallel here between that moral purpose, overcoming judgmentalism and negativism, and the nature of how a teacher treats a child?
It's, yeah, these are, what I'm talking about is basic human relationships, right? So if you just say, we could take it, it's how the teacher treats a child, it's how parents treat their children. We know, I mean, just I kind of think of way of characterizing some of the research on parenting, but we know, I would say, two things that don't work. One is the authoritarian coercive parent, and the other is a parent who leaves the kids alone and basically laissez-faire. Those are two good examples actually of leadership or lack of leadership, because if we try to be coercive, even if we are doing the right things, people rebel. If we leave everybody alone and say it's laissez-faire, then people either don't think we care and or they don't do anything. So the leader here and the teacher has to have empathy to the student who's not interested in learning. The teacher can't just be right, saying you've got to learn because it's good for you. That's not much of a strategy. And so we see the best teachers are the ones that motivate kids that aren't normally motivated. That's what they do. Same with adults in change leadership. Motivate those that aren't normally motivated. That's emotional leadership.
So the man who wrote the book Small is Beautiful wrote another book in which he characterized problems as either being convergent or divergent. And he said that divergent problems are ones where there's never expected to be a final agreement, but if you have love, there will always be a solution. Is love a word you use?
Sorry, I do use it, but not that way. I might say, we might make the case that if you have love, that everything else will be right, and possibly but that's not where I'm getting at. In fact, in the 6 Secrets of Change, the first one is called Love Your Employees. And by that I mean that you have this kind of attitude towards people that I can build relationships here, and that I can have what I've called impressive empathy, which makes me more likely to be able to relate to people. I can develop the conditions under which people will be more successful. And so one of the ways I put it is the best way to love teachers is to create the kind of culture whereby they can be successful. So to me, love is more of I hate to say it this way, but because I actually mean it sincerely, and it sounds manipulative when I say it this way, but love is a strategy and a human value that you relate to other people on the basis that you think that if you treat them well and you create learning conditions and you create the pressures within that. Another big one is peer pressure. For us, if you want to change the group, use the group to change the group. So there's several variables in here, not a whole number, but 3 or 4 that go together here that really tries to treat people better, build their capacity, put the right kind of pressure within the culture, and get new things happening, which people end up valuing and therefore wanting to do more of them. And it has to do with respect and love and trust, but it's not kind of, to me, a blind love that I'll go in there and love everybody and things will be all right.
And I'm not sure that I've represented Schumacher's work accurately, but I really like how you've described that. There was another element to trust that I really appreciated, which is the willingness to trust yourself as a leader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you. This is part of risk-taking, right? That you leaders who don't take risk about what they're doing don't learn much. So that you have to go through the learning curve in order to learn something. And if you don't take any risk, you don't expose yourself to that part. So I think it's this constellation of leaders, if we think about leadership qualities, where leaders are who eventually become effective. And this is where another thing where we miss something. If we see a great leader that's is being a leader for 20 years, we think, well, this person either is a born leader, is so fantastic. But what we don't see is the learning curve that they went through. Let's say we're talking about someone who's really effective as being a leader for 20 years. If we were to be able to go back to year 1 and year 2, we would see that person probably not very effective. But what they did is they learned to become more effective because they were learners. They were committed to that, and they made mistakes, and they didn't let mistakes destroy them. So I think that's very much part of that confidence. I forget what it was. Peters and Waterman, or I think it's Pfeffer and Sutton had a great definition of wisdom, which was something like using your knowledge while doubting what you know. That's a great way of putting it. So those leaders did use what they knew, but they also were open to say, I might be wrong, I have to learn in that. So I think this is trusting yourself as a learner and not being destroyed if you make mistakes.
We heard from Yang Zhao today in another keynote, and there's a very interesting connection here with how learners feel about themselves. Do you see that this translates then into learning environments where learners are willing to kind of learn to take risks themselves?
Yeah, I mean, we can go to, you possibly have had or looked at Carol Dweck's work on the mindset, the fixed and the growth mindset. And yes. She says it's exactly right. She said some people, and she was talking about people of all ages, but let's take students. Some people have a fixed mindset, and some people have a growth mindset. And the growth mindset are those students who or people who basically are not thrown by mistakes. They said, I made a mistake, but I've learned from it. I'm going to get better from it, and they treat it as a learning proposition. The fixed mindset people don't take as many chances because when they make a mistake, they feel it reflects totally on their own inner self, and so they play it safe. And she's actually, thankfully, been able to train people, the students, to have more of a growth mindset. So what Yang Zhao was saying is the same thing. You have to create the conditions where students see themselves as learners and have a growth mindset. And those conditions are, you're allowed to make mistakes. You're not punished in a immediate, narrow way about mistakes. You need to have a growth and a learning attitude towards them. And those are habits that you can, to a certain extent, cultivate in yourself. And they're definitely habits that the culture can create, the risk-taking learning culture versus the fixed punitive culture. Those are two very different cultures. One fosters and rewards learning, and the other one punishes mistakes.
So in the discussion of the differences between Canada and the United States, and I think you may be sort of uniquely in a position to comment on them, one of the things that comes up is the amount of lobbying money that's involved in decision-making in the U.S. Is that one of the factors that you look at when you think about the differences?
I don't think so. I think there is, I guess it is, well, first of all, the good qualities that are related to success, we see them a lot in the U.S. That is, it's not like that's not there. The trouble is they're there in small pockets, and they're really not dominant enough. But I think there's something about the quick fix mindset that politicians have in the U.S. There are exceptions, of course, where they think by legislating something, they can, they can get it done, and this impatient to try to solve a problem, and then the more that it never gets solved, the more they resort to, additional kind of heavy-handed methods. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. But I don't know what certainly there's differences in how the funding, where we have a lot more funding devoted on a per pupil basis to, it's more equitable, it's more focused on where it's needed. Governance, a big number, lots of school districts. Illinois has the same population as Ontario. They have 700 or 800 school districts. We have 72. So when you get that kind of layered on governance, it's hard to get it to cohere. So I think there's something mysterious going on, but whatever it is, that there's been too much of a quick fix mindset on the part of politicians and policymakers in the U.S., and that the more that it doesn't get fixed, ironically, the more that they want to get the next quick fix in place.
We're going to give our listeners a chance to ask some questions. We'll probably do it by the chat. Michael's on the telephone, so he won't be able to see the chat, but I'll keep track of them and try and answer them. So if you've got a question, please feel free to put it in the chat. And I'm going to ask one more question before we shift to that. Can you tell me what deprivatization of practice means? It means literally what it says, in a sense, the history of the teaching profession. This goes, Daddy in 1975, or whenever he was, when he wrote The School Teacher, he said the teaching is a lonely profession. The whole history of the teaching profession is behind the classroom door. So that what deprivatization means literally is opening the classroom door so that people can see what's happening and learn from each other. In fact, John Goodlatte in 1968, when I was a rookie, wrote a nice short book called Behind the Classroom Door. So the reason, and I'm answering more of your question they might have asked, but I'll just give you one more key point about it. When you have individual classroom autonomy, this means two things. One, it means it's a license to be creative, and the second, it means it's a license to be ineffective and to not know it, or to not have others knowing it. So if you put it to the positive side, we have quite a long history now of research that says when teachers collaborate in a focused way, which is deprivatization, if you like, and they're well led by school instructionally oriented principal and supportive principal, a lot more achievement gets done because they're focusing better, they're drawing on each other's resources, they're correcting things more readily because it's out in the open. So deprivatization, in brief, is when people's teaching practices are amenable to observation and correction, and when the results actually are known in terms of how well they're doing with their students. The positive way of putting it is we now call it social capital, which is when people work together in a focused way, well led, they get more done. This, for me, was one of those points in the book that had such a great connection to Deming, right? And it's part of your transparency section. Mm-hmm. And that is how understanding how real data helps everybody get better and not using data for judgmentalism. Did I get that right? Yeah. You did, because ironically, again, you get more accountability if you approach it indirectly. Indirectly is the data are out there, but it's used for improvement, not punishment, and you actually get more action, more accountability out of that. Whereas the direct method, which is you give people feedback and there's sticks and carrots attached to that, it doesn't work as effectively. It's Daniel Pink. What motivates people? What doesn't motivate people? Okay, so we're going to move to Q&A. We have got a few minutes left. If you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand. It's the third icon over. Maureen wants to know, is there a different attitude about children in Canada? I don't think so. I think there's tremendous passion in both countries for the future of children, the immediate future, and that. So there's no difference in the passion and commitment to children.
It just seems that the strategy of how to get there is more complicated and ineffective in the U.S., but not the commitment and not the way that children are valued and treated and seen. I don't think there's a big difference on that at all.
Catherine wants to know, what do school leaders do when a teacher refuses to work together or collaborate?
That's a good question, and it's a big question. That's because it's in motion leadership. But let me talk about briefly the what I call the resistance mindset. If a teacher refuses to collaborate, let me say what not to do. You can confront that teacher and have a power play. And we can predict that power play, you might win the battle and lose the war, but you'd probably spin off into losing both the battle and the war if you're a principal. So trying to confront it bluntly is not going to work. What we have is a combination of trying to get some action. So when I'll put it in 4 terms. One is, we say, give people respect before they've earned it. So here's the teacher that's not cooperating, and you're trying to give them respect before they've earned it, because where are they coming from? Try to understand it. Secondly, practice impressive empathy, which is, how do I be empathetic to this person who I really want to be happening, changing differently. Third is build a climate where they can be affected, so using peers to influence peers. And then the fourth one is we call deal firmly with what's left over. So in the case of the question that's asked, I would at the beginning give the person the benefit of the doubt. I would try to create conditions that would cause movement, and then I would eventually, if nothing worked, take action. Note what's happening here with the peers. So put it this way, that if I do that sequence that I just described, and then I take, let's say, negative action, if I use that word, the chances of me getting away with it in terms of the culture of that school with the peers is a lot greater than if I came in as a principal at the beginning and took negative action against a staff member. I wouldn't get away with it. The culture would rebel against it. So it's a subtle process, I guess. It's one where you have to try to figure out what is happening with that person. You try to create conditions that would put pressure and support in an integrated, positive way to cause movement and look for movement. And we've seen big changes actually in people. And then along the way, you might be more direct about it. But you can't get people to change just by ordering them to change, even if you have the formal authority.
Michael, what is it about you or your background that leads you to being such a good voice for this kind of clarity?
I'm not sure. I came into this not as an educator. I did my PhD in the 60s in sociology. I was fortunate to get in the ground up. There wasn't much major work on collaboration and implementation when I started, so I kind of grew up with the field. And maybe it's partly my sociology, which is that sensitivity to the group and how the strength and the weaknesses of groups. But mainly it's been I would say 2 things. One is it's a commitment to fix things, so that's something that that really engages me. How do you change Ontario's 5,000 schools? So that a commitment to problem solve is a driver, and the other is spending a lot of time immersed in the actual problems, and then getting smart about it as a result of those experiences. When Malcolm Gladwell made the 10,000-hour rule famous, which is if you are a learner and you really do apply yourself and you learn and get better and better over your so-called 10,000 hours plus, you actually do get better because you've immersed yourself in the reality of it and tried to problem solve. So I think to me it's that burning desire to see things improve, and then secondly to be part of the action in doing that. And as a result of doing that, to get, I guess you get smarter about. You've seen the patterns before. You get smarter about what works and what doesn't work, and you get more excited because you can think you can make a bigger difference. So I don't know whether that answers the question, but it's kind of a constellation of things that I just described.
It's a terrific answer, and it's been so much fun to talk to you. This is the reschedule of an interview that you unfortunately had to miss before. I really want to thank you for being willing to do it, especially as a part of this conference. It's a great way to finish our School Leadership Summit.
Well, you have a great question, Steve. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry the technical part didn't work, but I felt like I was with you anyways.
Yes, we felt like we've been with you. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. This has been Michael Fullan, the final keynote for this 2013 School Leadership Summit. Hope you've had a great time. Again, thanks, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Steve, everybody. Bye.
Bye now. Thanks, everybody, for joining. We're going to finish this session up. I'm going to click the recording off, and then those of you who would like can join us in the Summit After Party room, where we only spend a few minutes, but just sort of celebrating the day, and then we'll let you move on. But I hope it's been worthwhile for you. Thanks again to Michael, and thanks to all of you.